of today's events. My name is Shivani Ramalochan. I'm really delighted to welcome you to this one-on-one with Irenosen Okojie, who will be in conversation with one of Trinidad, the Caribbean, and I would say the diaspora's finest speculative fiction writers, fiction and poetry, Brandon O'Brien. Please give them a round of applause and welcome. I will let them take the stage. Enjoy.
Hello, good afternoon. I keep forgetting that it's afternoon, so thank you for reminding me. So I am very, very pleased this afternoon to be joining you all as we settle on this one-on-one with Irenosen Okojie, the author of many wonderful novels, including Nudibranch, the latest collection of short stories, and the winner of the Ako Kane Prize. I'm very excited to talk about all sorts of things, including the wonderful surrealism in those short stories, as well as some of the wonderful work that Irenosen is doing broadcasting and platforming Black speculative work in the diaspora. But before we get into that conversation, I would like to invite Irenosen to read from the collection for you all. So please, everyone give Irenosen a round of applause.
Thank you, Brandon, for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be joining you all. First time in the Caribbean, and fitting that it's Trinidad. So yeah, thank you all so much for having me. I'm going to read from Nudibranch, which is my collection of strange and fantastical short stories. This particular story, Grace Jones, just to preface it, is about a Grace Jones impersonator navigating a past trauma in the present. Once the stray parts of a singed scene had found their way into the bedroom, onyx edges gleaming, and the figures without memories had lost their molten heads to the coming morning, after she'd pressed her face against the space under the doorway, crying, reaching for some untouched handful of earth as sustenance, the agency called, Hassan more specifically. She'd narrowed down the things she planned to do that day to 3 options: stark, cold, and clinical, on a creased receipt for a disco light-hued Roland Mouret jacket she'd worn only once. But the phone rang, shrill, invasive, demanding, still on the floor, the wood cold against her skin. She crawled to the receiver, tentatively, as if her limbs were tethered to a thread on the Earth's equator, the thread bending and collapsing into the different stages of her life. She contemplated the ways she could delay each inevitable outcome on the receipt. She could swallow it, wait for its disintegration in her stomach, acid eroding the words into nothing. Or she could simply misplace it in the flat somewhere, not outside, definitely not outside. It would be gone forever then. She'd have to go through options again, add new ones, whittle it down. That process had left her brain frazzled overnight, her heart leaking through the bedroom keyhole, making a sucking sound as her hands turned to wax. The receipt would have to be misplaced indoors. That would give her the option of attempting to stretch the boundaries of time despite an internal wound the shape of a turret. In her mind, the draftsman was God. He had placed the turret inside her chest. Earlier, he'd drawn her in various angles, electrical blue lines delivering degrees of shock from the same incident. Each time she got up, each time she felt the weight of the turret tumbling in the ether. She picked up the receiver, cradled it firmly, careful not to let it slip from her grasp the way things had of late. For a few seconds, there was silence at the other end. She knew it was Hassan. He usually waited several beats before speaking, as if allowing you time to adjust to a different frequency. He never introduced himself. He just expected you to know, and she always did. Sidra, so there's a party tonight. You don't have to attend. Might be fun though. The guy is a big Grace Jones fan. I've texted you the address. Do what you do. Any problems? Call me. Cool? Bets. She almost told him about the draftsman then. She found herself wanting to do it at the most unexpected times. Instead, she put the receiver down, hands trembling. She checked the table for the receipts. It had fallen onto the floor by the radiator, already misplacing itself. She'd forgotten to tell Hassan that she was considering taking an evening class 1 day a week. They were like that, so many things constantly left unsaid. She'd never asked him what a French-Algerian man was doing running a lookalike agency in London, amongst other things. And he'd never asked what a girl from Martinique with a degree in forensics was doing moonlighting as a Grace Jones impersonator. The translated versions of themselves staring at each other silently from the opposite sides of a revolving door. There was a building that remained a husk, a blackened charcoal carcass gutted from the inside out. The carcass leaned against the heavens in protest at its losses, at its snatched internal sky tainted with the fingerprints of one last daily procession, rituals of the living. And while the world slept, awoke, the cities hummed with chaos and order, rivers began in cotton pockets, cupping slackened fists. The waters undulated into lost reflections. The gods got high off the colors from the seas. The equator adjusted itself only slightly. The stars twinkled in haphazard collusion. The mountains dappled by hammertan winds that became personal directions. The building remained, an artificial gut bathed in degrees of light, lodged in the stages of a day. The building was a hollow within a carcass, within a husk, within a world, within a galaxy. A series of crooked boxes, varying in size, inside each other, where the gift was always the same, always attached to a bottom that had gone missing. On each floor of the husk, Sidra was running backwards to the late afternoon of a day. It had been flat-packed into cardboard boxes sealed with sellotape. On each floor, Sidra peeled off the sellotape, the sound a split in the air whose line couldn't be traced. She removed items from the box. The late afternoon that day was made up of ingredients for cake: eggs, flour, butter, sugar, tinfoil, a whisk, vanilla. On each floor, Sidra ran to the window where she stood in costumes made of tinfoil. On floor 1, she was covered with eggs, screaming. On floor 2, she was drenched in flour, howling. On floor 3, she was soaked in butter, melting as a heat intensified while the whisk whirred ominously on the periphery, and so on. Grace Jones's La Vie en Rose played on a radio that wasn't plugged in anywhere. Instead, the plug sprang from the bottom of the building like an untethered electrical root. The husk shook. On each floor, Sidra grabbed the whisk. Lost scenes fell out from the windows. Water was inadequate. Hoses throbbed with adrenaline and burned hearts. Death traps. The lifts became stuck all over again, spewing firemen's costumes like overgrown fabricated insects. Like Genesis on speed, everything escalated quickly. Ashes assembled into figures, crawling on the skyline before colluding with the traffic, which destroyed them all over again. The equator turned a fraction. The flames rose. The bottoms of the crooked boxes were set alight. Debris became glowing cinders that walked. A dot appeared on the galaxy. The draftsman held a flame. He angled like a stick of lead, like a tool that could change guise at any point. Sidra had first seen Grace on TV. She must have been around 13 at the time. She'd been chasing Carla and Dorian, who were playing with a set of screwdrivers behind the sofa, darting forwards and backwards in a mock game of fencing, shouting, "On guard!" sporadically, brandishing the screwdrivers like long, elegantly carved swords. The washing machine was spinning. The windows were open to hide evidence of her botched attempt at gumbo. The smoke alarm was broken. Half an hour earlier, it had beeped incessantly. In her frustrated efforts to silence it, she'd broken it with a broom. But none of that mattered because a woman who looked like her was on TV. Pulled to the screen by an instinct she didn't quite understand, she stared. It was on BBC One. She'd never seen a black woman so unapologetically dark on the screen. It was beautiful, and she was hypnotized. Dressed in an all-black catsuit, the woman was tall, striking, otherworldly, confident. Her mouth painted fire engine red. Her head was in an off-yellow helmet shaped like a bee's nest. Sidra half expected a swarm of bees to hover over the woman's head. The queen bee in action. She felt as if they shared the same womb, separated by a few decades and a trail of bees' fat with mutual DNA and womb lining. Grace Jones, they said, Grace Jones. She repeated the words aloud, feeling them roll off her tongue while the washing machine spun, while Carla and Dorian swapped the screwdrivers for Power Ranger toys, starting wars in patois. The screen jumped, flickered, the picture vanished. Grace had been brought to her on a signal from Jupiter. She grabbed the hanger on the floor behind the TV, stretched its curved head and inserted it into the television's aerial socket. The picture returned. Grace was gone, replaced by an item on an infected brand of milk. Her heart sank, but the image of Grace was burned into her head as if with an iron. She ran to her mother's room, opened her makeup drawers, searching through the lipsticks, pouting her lips. She flung the wardrobe door open, its mirrors multiplying her automatically. She dived in. In the dark, she heard the flutters of a wing. A bee with a fire engine red mouth floated in a trail of static. Thank you.
I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you for that reading. Thank you so very much.
Pleasure.
As we begin our conversation about this collection, which I avidly remind everyone that you can get at any of the booksellers in the atrium whenever you feel, one of the things that immediately struck me is, as an avid enjoyer of the surreal myself, I adored this collection and some of the absolute pivots in world building that take place in some of these stories. But they all still felt not only uniquely dramatically grounded, but uniquely grounded in a sense of place and identity for all of these characters in those stories. And I guess one of the questions that I had immediately for you is, as a writer, what do you consider is the place that the surreal has as a genre in the Black imagination?
Wow, what a question to lead with. For me, it's everything, as you can see from the collection. When I first started writing short stories, I was really trying to make sense of my own lived experiences as a young black woman, originally born in Nigeria, but kind of growing up in London, and struggling, I guess, with the kind of invisibility you have in that space. So discovering literature that spoke to me in that way, and the fact that you could kind of bend language. You know, I was reading people like June Jordan, Toni Morrison, really kind of Samuel R. Delany, radical writers, each in their own different way. And this idea of the more experimental, kind of playful space started to open up to me, and I started playing with writing short stories. So kind of that intermingling of the everyday and the surreal felt like a space where my imagination could thrive. And for me, it's a really important aspect of that kind of speculative genre, because it gives a certain freedom that I felt I didn't have. I'm incapable of writing a straight story. I can't do it. You know, I've tried, it just doesn't come out of me in that way. It's always bent, it's always skewed, and the ideas are kind of always left field and offbeat. So I'm leaning, I think, into my natural inclinations. But what was wonderful was getting permission from certain writers, you know, knowing that, okay, people like Octavia Butler existed, and looking to her work, being inspired by what she was doing. I mentioned June Jordan. Jamaica Kinsid is another writer that I just think is incredible, that doesn't really get enough credit, and what she was doing with her playfulness with language. So these authors kind of made me feel like, okay, yeah, there is a space for you here, and, you know, see what you can do with it. For me, it's language is everything. Toni Morrison has this amazing quote about language, about writers doing language. That, for me, really speaks to what drives my writing. Is I love language. I love the richness of it. I love what I can do with imagery. I love being able to surprise the reader and myself in that process. So, yeah, it feels like the surreal is a space that speaks to me very, very naturally. Yeah.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah.
Pivoting kind of immediately from that sense of surprise, one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about some of these stories in this collection is that they're using surreal imagery specifically to engage very deeply with trauma and violence in ways that are both visually very arresting, but also very revealing about how those characters or the world perceive violence. I'm thinking both of Grace Jones, which you read very powerfully from, but also specifically Saudade -1, which is one of my favorites in the collection, where it is very obvious that like something very like ruinous and upsetting has taken place in the world, but every time you get to see more and more about like the layers of violence that is taking place in that space, it's always a new and challenging image. And I guess one of the things I'm curious about is, what do you think the surreal as a genre reveals to the reader about either the ways that we experience or the ways that we imagine and discuss trauma and violence in the real world?
Yeah, no, that's powerful. I think for me, it's a transformational space, you know, it sounds cliche to say it, but it's true, you know, taking that trauma and that pain and finding ways to make it beautiful, or, you know, create an image that, like you say, just reveals layers and layers to that character's experience. Again, with Nudibranch, when I was working on the collection, there's a lot of personal trauma in my family background, and writing this collection literally saved my life at the time, because, as I say, the writing space, if I didn't have the writing space, I don't know what I would have done in order to deal with those personal traumas. So being able to use it in that way and use the surreal to reveal things about characters, especially complicated, messy black female characters, because we're often not given that level of humanity, and it's something that I'm really, really passionate about. Also because it's just very boring to write nice characters and nice female characters. So, you know, some of the themes that I touch in the book are also themes that I've experienced or friends of mine have experienced, but using that language, using the surreal in order to kind of make sense of it, but also very much anchoring it so you really get a sense of the character going on some sort of a trajectory, is hugely important, because I don't want someone to read the story and just think, oh, this is just nice flights of fancy, because that could also easily happen. So it's the combination of anchoring it in really real experiences, but also bringing them into a world that feels revelatory, you know, that feels like, okay, I'm learning something here, or I'm seeing this character. I don't necessarily agree with what they've done, but I'm seeing them and I'm having compassion and empathy for them and why they've made the decisions that they've made, you know. So for me, that's really core and important. So yeah, I think that the genre itself, I call it Afro-surrealism, is an amazing space, you know, and I love operating in that space, like I said, because of the freedom of the imagination it allows me to have. I have a freedom in that space, I feel, in a way that doesn't exist in the world, that I have on the page, which to me is so, so powerful. You know, as a black woman, as a woman of color, there are inhibitions out there in the world, but on the page, that does not exist for me. And I think with this collection, I really wanted to celebrate that, with Speak Gargantula as well, but Nudibranch even more so. So yeah, it's really at the core of what, why I write and what I want to do with my stories. Yeah.
So that freedom of space speaks to a question that I typically ask very often. Someone actually joked in a previous panel today that I should always ask it every time I enter the old fire station, because it's not so much a revealing or radical thing for most writers, but it's a thing that a lot of people need to hear writers reckon with, which is, as you are a Nigerian British writer, I'm sure there are moments in the editing process, in the submissions process, where there is this sense of how do you navigate both being accessible and palatable to audiences that do not know a great deal of your experience while remaining authentic to the people who do, and how there are several layers of gatekeeping for writers of various diasporas that are constructed specifically to judge your experience and be so like harshly critical about things that you know are real and true that you're attempting to portray in your work, and how you navigate that in your own process. Like, how do you negotiate what is for you and what is for the reader in that sense? And I kind of want to kind of give you the opportunity to, this is your soapbox in this moment, to kind of preach how do you personally
what's
bridge
for
that
me
gap.
and what's for the reader. I'm going to be really honest and say that ultimately I firstly write for myself, so I don't worry about the reader initially, because stories and writing and creating is like a form of sustenance for me. It's a way I would do it whether I got published or not. You know, that's the thing, I would. It's just I'm lucky that I got to be published in that sense. But yeah, I would do it regardless. So that's one thing. If I worried about audiences, then probably I would police myself more. So it's really good to not think about that until after the book's written. Every writer will have a different response to this, but this is how I feel. And I think that if you're truly being authentic to yourself as a writer, it will find its audience, whether it's small or medium or large. It will find its way out into the world. It will speak to certain people. So that's what I hope for. I've been very lucky in that all my books have been published by black women. So I'm unusual in that sense. So my first two books, my novel Butterfly Fish and my collection Speak Gargantula, was published by an independent press in the UK called Jacaranda Books, which is founded by Valerie Brands, a black woman who read my short stories, loved them, and said, we really want to publish you and we really like what you're doing. So I didn't have that experience of being policed in that way. I was very, very lucky in that she understood where I was coming from. There was a shorthand. There were things that I didn't have to explain. So yeah, that was great. And then similarly, my books with Hachette, my publisher is also a black woman, Charmaine Lovegrove, who runs Dialogue Imprint, and she's amazing, just a phenomenal force of nature and hugely supportive of myself and the other writers, black and Asian writers that she publishes. And she's very, very passionate that we get to tell those stories authentically and, share our lived experiences in ways that really feel authentic and speak to us as well as the audience. So to answer your question, I haven't been policed in that way. Obviously, I go through the process of being edited, and that in itself is interesting. And yeah, I've grown in that process. In the beginning, I hated being edited. When you do the work for ages, and then you give it to an editor, and you're like, this editor's insane. They want a different book. This is crazy. I remember calling my agent, my first agent, saying that having having gotten the feedback from my then editor. And I was like, she wants me to write a different book. She's nuts. But actually, when I sat with some of what she said, some of it spoke to me and some of it didn't. And what didn't speak to me, I just didn't take on because I was very clear on what my intentions were for the book, and I wanted to stick to that. But yeah, it's really a process, and it's also collaborative because the book isn't just yours, right? Once you get to the stage of being published, it's, you know, your editor's invested, the publisher's invested, the marketing people are invested. So it feels more like this thing that is shared. And, you know, you want to be respectful to everybody in that process, but you also want to ensure that the book is doing you justice, is doing your vision and your ideas for it justice, and it's living up to, you know, your expectations for it. So, yeah, it's a complicated process, but hopefully if you have, you know, an editor that really values your voice, they're going to want to ensure that the book is as you wanted it to be, whilst making it the best that it can be. I always say that a great editor elevates your work. You should feel really excited by the time the book's coming out, not deflated, you know, not like you've been over-policed or, yeah.
Nice. And I do want to interject by saying I think you have experienced that kind of fortune that I hope that everyone else experiences, which is being primarily published by a black woman. I think is a very radical kind of experience, and I'm very glad that that's a thing that you got to experience in your career. And it kind of immediately dovetails into one of the things I really wanted to pick your brain about, which is Black to the Future, a multidisciplinary Afrofuturist festival that you are the director and founder of, creating this wonderful space for black creators across the diaspora and in multiple fields to navigate and connect and share their work. I immediately want to learn everything about this all of a sudden right now. I'd like to ask, can you share more about what was the impetus for you making that space and how the experience of curating that space has been so far?
No, thank you so much. Yeah, firstly, I've really been blown away by the level, we were saying this earlier, the level of interest that Black to the Future has had. But in its first sort of form, I guess, it was originally supposed to be just like a weekend takeover. Because one of the things I do is I also curate as well as write. I've been working in the art scene in the UK for a long time as a programmer and curator. So it's something that I love doing, and I've been having conversations with Sarah Ville, who was then at Clean Prose, about putting this takeover on, you know, celebrating the black sort of Afrofuturistic and speculative space, you know, having this weekend across different disciplines. And we were both super excited about it. Then the pandemic happened, so we couldn't do anything about it then. And Clean Prose, the organization, the venue where it was supposed to be held, shut down. But Sarah and I kept talking about it, kept dreaming about Black to the Future. And I had already sort of curated the first program, and that, in fact, that was what I presented to her as what it would look like. So it was really me just thinking about dream curations and wanting to manifest that into existence, but also thinking about this diasporic space, this black diasporic space, where obviously with Afrofuturism, it's very much often through the lens of looking at black stories through the intersection of you know, science and technology. But I wanted to expand that even more, because I think that's really important, to also look at the past, because you can't really see the future unless you look at the past, look at the present, and look across disciplines. There are so many outstanding black artists doing incredible things, and you know, often on the margins, you know, people are not aware of what they're doing, or they're not aware of each other. So the idea of making it a festival felt really, really powerful, and felt really intentional in terms of what we wanted to achieve. And then we started talking to venues about it, like the British Library. I'm vice chair at the Royal Society of Literature, so I spoke to Molly Rosenberg about it, who's the director there, and she loved it, and she's a real champion of artists of color and wanting to kind of open up space for them. So they felt like a natural partner to bring on board, but also like the Standard Hotel, the Garden Cinema. So moving across these different spaces also felt like it strengthened the festival, because it gives it this kind of expansive quality, and it's not just one venue. We were kind of taking over spaces in London, and amazing. We had some great emerging voices as part of the festival, which is really important to me, but also some big names, because you need that. So we had Adjoa Ando from Bridgerton as one of our headliners. We had Terence Nance, who's an incredible filmmaker. He had a series on HBO and collaborates with the likes of Andre 3000, Solange Knowles, so he headlined for us. And yeah, just Calla Singleton, who's one of the first, I think the actual first black woman sci-fi editor in the UK as part of the festival. Like, the names were brilliant, and it was, diasporic, which is what I wanted. So it's supposed to be every 2 years, but we also want to do standalone events in between, and hopefully having a conversation with Bocas. I saw your hands go. In terms of doing something in 2026. But yeah, it's something that I want to be international as well as, in the UK. And black artistry is phenomenal. It's amazing. It's given me so much life in my career. So I want to just keep opening up the space, and that's what Black to the Future is there for. Yeah, that's a really long answer to you.
Oh no, I love long answers. If I could be here for the next 3 hours just hearing about Black to the Future, I would, but thank you so very much. So this is the moment where I let everyone else know that if you would like to ask your own questions, because you find my questions boring or annoying, this is an option that you have now as well. The floor is now open to questions. A reminder to not everyone in this room that a comment and a question, while vaguely resembling each other, can be distinguished by the tail. That is, please ask a question and not leave a comment. But I would love very much to hear what the audience would have to ask of Irenosen this evening. Aha, a hand. Hi, Akila. Hello.
I have two questions, if that's okay.
Yes.
So with the first question, I know there's often a conversation around different writing traditions like surrealism, and about who or which groups or which cultures the tradition belongs to. That I think often authors of color have to engage with for whatever reason, because we are living in the systems that we're living in. And I noticed that you said the term Afrofuturist. So I just wondered if you could expand exactly what that means for you and in relation to your work, or in general. And then also, what is the short story form offering you in particular in terms of writing surrealism in comparison to novels? Because I find that I really love books. There's something about short story collections. I haven't quite my big right. Maybe you could share your thoughts on it. It really sings in a way that I really do.
Yeah, really good questions. Afro-surrealism. I guess by that I mean from a tradition of blackness, from a history of blackness. So I spent my formative years in Nigeria. I moved to the UK when I was 8, but I grew up listening to oral storytelling, griot style storytelling, where the stories change, the endings change, or the middles change, depending on who was telling it. And often these stories were quite fantastical. So those were like my experiences of the surreal. So it's very much kind of in my bones, you know. So when people ask me, because I've been asked by people before, oh, you know, the South Americans invented it, and where did you get it from? Did you copy the South Americans? I'm like, no, I didn't. I didn't even know about that. That's just purely coincidental. And of course, I love Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I love his work, but that was not what influenced me to start writing in that space. I actually grew up listening to stories like that in Nigeria. So that's where that comes from. And in terms of the short story I just love short stories. I love that there's an ending, you know, whereas with a novel, you better love that idea because you're going to sit with it for some years, you know. And for me, the danger zone is always the middle, writing a novel. I have all the enthusiasm in the world in the beginning. And then by the middle, I'm like, oh my God, how am I going to pull all these threads together? But with the shorts, I find short stories such a feverish process. And I love that there's a real buzz and excitement for me. Like there's a feeling of surprise. I never know where the stories are going to go. I never have the ideas fully formed in my head when I'm starting one because I like the element of surprise. I like the elasticity that comes with writing a short story. You know, people often say, oh, short stories are really, really hard. They're really technical. I never thought about them in that way. For me, I read a short story collection by an American writer called Dennis Johnson, and that collection blew my mind. Jesus' Son, incredible. And it was about this drug addict, really, interconnected short stories, but it had such compassion and it brought you into his world. And I did not know the short form could do that. I didn't know. I thought only novels did that. That set a fire under me when I read that collection. And I've been in love with the short form since. So for me, it feels like a real injection of energy. You know, if I'm working on a novel and I'm stressed about it or I'm struggling with momentum, I just go off and write a short story. And suddenly, like, I feel that energy again. Also, when I was coming back to work on my redrafts of my novels, I Jedi mind tricked myself basically into seeing each chapter of the novel as a kind of connected short story. And that was how I got over the mountain of, oh my God, this is really difficult writing this novel, you know. So I love moving between the forms. For me, it's great. And yeah, short stories are amazing. I also love the novel form. I'm sounding like I don't, but I do love that as well. Yeah. Good questions.
Nice, thank you. Any other questions? Is there a question? I see it.
It's not a question, sorry. I came in a bit late. I would love to hear, if it's a little piece of your work, if you can share something.
Late?
I came in late, I'm asking.
Sorry, I just
did you
amplified
share
that.
already? So I really would like to hear some, if that's okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
there will
Sorry
be
about
space.
that.
There will be space for another reading
Oh, great.
before we close. Yes. Does anyone else have a question? Okay, if there are no other questions, I guess this is a wonderful opportunity for you to read a thing. This is me reminding all of you lovely people again that if you would like to get yourself a copy of Nudibranch so you can have it signed after this session, they're available at all of the booksellers in the library atrium. It is actually wonderful. I absolutely adore it, and I think you will adore it as well. But with that being said, thank you all, and we will pass the mic again to Irenosen to read again from this wonderful collection.
Thank you so much. So this is from a short story called Mangata, in which an albino man returns back home to Mozambique following his mother's death. The man who brought a miracle to the small town in northern Mozambique was both remarkable and ordinary. As an albino, he wasn't an unfamiliar sight, although other things indicated he was different. He walked with a certain comfort in his skin that wasn't of the surroundings, assured, confident. He had a birthmark on his neck, which looked like a stem growing from his movements. His nails were painted black, his hands elegant, the fingers long, tapered. His tongue sported a silver ring at the tip, a pink-pierced entity darting out readily to abandon his mouth. On the afternoon Terry Midas arrived, it was scorching. He stood waiting at the pickup point near the market, a black god painted alabaster, holding his light travel bag. His batik shirt had sweat patches. Tan trousers stuck to his clammy thighs uncomfortably. The dust-covered leather sandals he wore felt heavy, he having walked a few miles in the bush to get to this point. He'd done so with trepidation, fear scattering wildfire into his veins as it spread through his limbs. He knew the stories of albinos being persecuted, hunted for the value of their body parts, kidnapped, killed, and sold. During the walk, in his mind's eye, he'd seen flashes of cutlasses raised up, bones on the necks of men whispering in the voices of ancestors, the cries of medicine men splintered in his ears. He'd seen blood in the sky and the trees shedding pale skin. He'd arrived at the market gratefully, spat from the tortuous bush, out of breath. 10 years away, and nothing had prepared him for the intensity of being back. The heat, the dusty roads, the shanty houses made quaint by the distance of separation. The slick black bodies rhapsodic in their freedom. He hadn't been primed for the warmth, small bursts of joy, the fear, the feeling of familiarity, the feeling of being foreign, a mouthful of echoes slipping teasingly out of reach. Sweating profusely, he stood, walked to a shaded corner of the shop he decided to wait at, thinking of albinos that had appeared to him through night traffic, hundreds of them, each holding angles of light doubling as rabbit holes. It came to him then, the memory of that night years ago, the thick, suffocating heat, sluggish grasshoppers chorusing, mosquitoes hovering around the one stubby, shrinking candle in their shack, as if drawn to a possible death. Mama Carlos sat snoozing gently by the door to protect him in a ritual that saw her bloodshot eyes close reluctantly, eventually succumbing to the demands of the body, her large bosom rising steadily up and down, the small picture of Christ pinned on the wall above the green mosquito net, which swooped down. Tiny winged fireflies with far too much gumption zigzagging above their heads, and Christ's robe singed from the blue candle flame that thought it could fly, bending willfully in the heat, his eyes temporarily blinded by tiny bloodshot figures taking residence there. Terry on the bed, tossing and turning, the sound of water in the empty petrol can on the floor by his pillow of bunched clothes. Then 3 men kicked down their door. He saw the glint of blades at Mama Carlos's throat, heard rough, urgent orders being issued, Mama Carlos screaming so loudly their response was a backhand slap to her face. Terry shrank back against the wall, powerless, pale and trembling. Necklaces of small bones on the men's necks jangled, their faces partially obscured by handkerchiefs tied over their mouths. The smell of the day's sweat from their bodies mingled with fear in the room was potent. They dragged him to the rusted white truck outside, dumped him in the back, then piled in laughing, the truck screeching away, exhaust pipe smoke curling around the edges of an abduction. They sped off. The truck eventually wound its way around the bush. It was at this point Terry leapt out, running for his life. He ran so fast blindly, an alabaster boy slipped from the world's pocket into the night's cruel playground. He ignored the scratches of wild plants on his legs, the stinging on his arms. The men had left the truck, whistling crudely, clicking their fingers to catch him again. A path snaked through the bush, appearing from nowhere, glimmering, rising, rushing, similar to the noise made in their petrol can at home. He ran along the path. He never remembered how he got all the way back to the village. He'd cried in relief at the people gathered holding kerosene lamps, babbling at them frantically, half out of his mind and skin, and everything being in the wrong place, their shack uprooted from Mama Carlos's injuries, the girl who'd given him a green banana earlier in the day, balancing a basket of bones instead on her head, clicking her fingers, crisis photo tearing through the roots of the truck, his face covered with a soiled handkerchief, Mama Carlos screaming into the petrol can, the candle flame growing into a blue-tongued carcass in the bush, and the lines of the night reduced into the shape of a howl beneath tires crunching on stones. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. So, since we have a little bit of time left before we leave, I decided I'm going to tease the audience. Because you have a novel coming out very soon.
I do, yeah, June.
You should briefly let everyone in the audience know what that novel is about as well, so they can keep their eye out for it.
You're very good to flag this up. So I have a novel called Curandera out in June. It's about shamanism and female desire, as well as sort of revenge. It's a mythic revenge novel too, but it's across dimensions. So yeah, moving between spaces and time with black characters and characters of color. I'm really excited about it. So hopefully I'll come back again to Bocas with it next year. Yeah.
That is your homework for the future, to not only get yourself a copy of Nudibranch, but keep your eyes out for Curandera when it does come out. And with that, we're going to give you the one unique blessing in the old fire station of having a session finish earlier rather than later. If you would like to get your copy signed, we will be moving to the signing area beside the old fire station building. So if you would like to get your own copy, whether you have one now or need to rush to the atrium to get one, please do so. And other than that, I hope that you enjoy the rest of Fantastic Friday. There will be a session right here at the top of the hour, the New Talent Showcase, with 4 brilliant and talented writers sharing from their new work, if you want to come back and see what the future of Trinidadian letters has for you. But other than that, I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the Bocas Lit Fest 2024. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you, Brandon, as well, for a beautiful conversation. So beautifully steered. Thank you so much.